The village that never looked untidy. There were villages in England that seemed to belong less to the present day than to memory. They existed in a sort of gentle defiance of time, with clipped hedges, ancient stone walls, and cottages whose windows shone as though they had never known dust, grief, or disappointment. Larkenby was one of those villages. It lay in a shallow green fold of countryside, not grand enough to be famous, and not remote enough to be forgotten. The road into it curved past a duck pond, a row of lime trees, and a whitewashed inn with hanging baskets, so carefully tended that they looked almost painted. There was a church with a square Norman tower, a post office that sold everything from stamps to lemon drops, and a village green where children still played on summer afternoons under the watchful gaze of mothers and grandmothers. To any passing visitor, Larkenby offered the reassuring appearance of a place untouched by disorder. Its people smiled, its gardens bloomed, its brass door knockers gleamed. Its gossip, where it existed, had the tidy sound of harmless domesticity. And yet there are places, as Miss Marple had often reflected, where tidiness itself could become suspicious. She was sitting by the window of the drawing room at Rosebank Cottage when the thought occurred to her for the third time that morning. Rosebank belonged to an old acquaintance of hers, Mrs. Lavinia Colwell, a widow of comfortable means and sharp opinions, who had invited Miss Marple to stay for a fortnight on the grounds that country air was restorative and village life, in moderate doses, infinitely instructive. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Colwell had written, "you are wasted in St. Mary Mead. If you must sit quietly and notice the worst in human nature, you might at least do it somewhere with better roses." Miss Marple had accepted. Now, in the mild light of an April morning, she sat with her knitting in her lap, her pale eyes moving from the garden path to the lane beyond, where village life presented itself in charming fragments. A boy in short trousers cycled past with newspapers under one arm. The vicar's wife crossed the road carrying tulips. Somewhere nearby a dog barked twice and was immediately silenced, as if even enthusiasm in Larkenby must not be excessive. Mrs. Colwell came into the room with the Morning Post, her silk skirts rustling. "You're doing it again," she said. Miss Marple looked up mildly. "Doing what?" "Looking innocent while observing everybody. It is most unsettling." Miss Marple smiled. "I am sure I do nothing of the sort. You do precisely that. It is one of the reasons I invited you. There is something in this village I dislike, and I haven't yet settled exactly what it is." "That is a feeling one should never ignore," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Colwell sorted through the letters with an air of brisk disapproval. "Larkenby is too perfect. Perfect places are seldom comfortable for long." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She had learned long ago that when people made general statements, what they really meant was often something much smaller and much more personal. She waited. "Sure enough," Mrs. Colwell said, "everyone speaks too well of everyone else." "Indeed?" "Yes, it is unnatural. A village ought to contain a proper amount of dissatisfaction, a little envy, a little complaint, a good many opinions about curtains and unsuitable marriages. It keeps people honest." She handed Miss Marple a note. "Here, you have been invited to tea this afternoon." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and read the neat hand. "Miss Honoria Weatherby requests the pleasure of Miss Marple's company at tea, 4 o'clock at Weatherby Hall." "How civil," said Miss Marple. "Civil?" Mrs. Colwell gave a short laugh. "My dear Jane, when Honoria Weatherby is civil, it is because she has decided one may be useful." Miss Marple folded the note carefully. "And is Miss Weatherby useful herself? She owns half the village, funds the church roof, presides over every committee worth having, and has buried 2 brothers, 1 fiancé, and a number of dogs with equal composure. She's admired by everybody." "That sounds exhausting." "It is, particularly as she deserves it." Miss Marple glanced out of the window again. Farther down the lane, beyond a row of yew hedges and a stand of lilacs, rose the grey stone front of Weatherby Hall. It was not a grand country house by the standards of the truly rich, but in Larkenby it carried a weight all its own. Old money had settled there and spread outward into the village like a second climate. Tenancies, patronage, repairs, fêtes, scholarship funds, Christmas parcels and summer luncheons all had, in one way or another, passed through the hands of the Weatherby family, and now, it seemed, chiefly through the hands of Miss Honoria Weatherby. By 3:30 that afternoon, the sky had turned a soft silver blue. Miss Marple, neatly dressed in dove grey, was driven to the hall in Mrs. Colwell's small motor car, since Mrs. Colwell declared that walking to a formal tea was admirable for people under 60 and absurd for everyone else. Wetherby Hall stood behind wrought-iron gates and a sweep of gravel bordered by clipped box. Its facade was handsome without warmth. Ivy climbed one side, and the windows, though spotless, gave little away. A maid admitted Miss Marple and led her into a morning room overlooking the south lawn. Miss Honoria Wetherby rose from an upright chair near the fire. She was a tall woman in her late 60s, still straight-backed, with silver hair drawn smoothly away from a face that might once have been beautiful and was now distinguished instead. Her expression was composed, intelligent, and, notwithstanding the courtesy of her welcome, not entirely relaxed. "Miss Marple, how very good of you to come. The pleasure is mine." Tea was already laid with all the delicate precision wealth so often mistakes for ease. The china was fine, the cake cut into exact squares, and the flowers arranged with that studied simplicity which usually requires a professional. There were two other guests, Dr. Julian Fenwick, the village physician, a handsome man of about 45 with an agreeable voice and excellent manners, and Mrs. Elspeth Dane, the rector's sister, whose eyes had the bright, restless quality of a bird's. Conversation began pleasantly enough. The weather, the state of the roads, the difficulty of getting good domestic staff, the melancholy decline of standards in Marmalade, all were covered with suitable intelligence. Dr. Fenwick told an anecdote about an elderly patient who had hidden cough lozenges in her Bible. Mrs. Dane spoke feelingly about spring bulbs. It was, Miss Marple thought, one of the most polished teas she had attended in years, and beneath it something trembled. It was difficult to say how she perceived it. No single remark was wrong, no glance was overt. Yet a kind of carefulness hung over the room, as though each person present had decided, consciously or otherwise, that there was one subject not to be approached, and was circling around it with elaborate grace. That subject, when it finally emerged, did so by accident, or what looked like accident. Mrs. Dane, reaching for the milk, said, "I saw Mr. Harcourt in the churchyard yesterday. Such a devoted soul, always checking the memorial stones." A stillness followed, very slight, so slight that a less observant woman might not have registered it at all. Miss Wetherby set down her teacup with absolute steadiness. "Yes," she said, "Edwin has always taken a conscientious interest in village matters." Dr. Fenwick added, "He is one of those men who cannot rest unless there is some useful little duty to occupy him." "Quite," said Mrs. Dane, though not with conviction. Miss Marple accepted another slice of cake and said in her gentle way, "Mr. Harcourt is a relation of yours?" "A distant cousin," said Miss Wetherby, "and my estate manager in practice, though not in title. He oversees several local matters that would otherwise become tiresome." "I see. Larkenby owes him a good deal," said Dr. Fenwick smoothly. And again there was that carefulness. The conversation shifted, but Miss Marple, who had long found that people reveal more in what they avoid than in what they say, stored the name away. After tea, Miss Wetherby proposed a turn in the garden. The lawns ran broad and immaculate down to an old stone wall, beyond which fields opened in pale spring green. Tulips stood in disciplined rows. Gravel crunched softly underfoot. "It is a peaceful place," Miss Marple observed. Miss Wetherby looked over the grounds. "Peace must be maintained, Miss Marple. It does not happen on its own." There was no mistaking the firmness beneath the remark. "No," said Miss Marple softly, "it rarely does." They were nearing a side path shaded by beech trees when a man appeared from the direction of the stables and came toward them. He was perhaps in his early 50s, a year square-shouldered, clean-shaven, and meticulously dressed in a dark coat despite the mild weather. His hair was iron grey, his features regular, and his expression so self-contained that one might have called him reserved, were it not for the sharpness in his eyes. "Miss Wetherby," he said, "I beg your pardon. I did not realise you had company." "Mr. Harcourt," said Miss Wetherby, "you know Dr. Fenwick, and this is Miss Marple, who is staying with Mrs. Colwell." Mr. Harcourt bowed slightly. "I am pleased to make your acquaintance." His voice was pleasant, almost too pleasant. It had the well-modulated quality of someone who had spent years smoothing away whatever he truly felt. Miss Marple murmured the proper response and looked at him. He was, she thought, one of those men who inspire confidence in committees and discomfort in servants. Reliable, efficient, correct, and curiously without softness. Yet his face carried signs of strain, a hollowness at the temple, a tightness about the mouth, the look of a man sleeping badly but determined that nobody should notice. Miss Weatherby said, "Was there something you wanted?" "Only the tenancy accounts. I left them in the study." "You may have them sent to your cottage." He hesitated. So slight a pause that once again it might have been missed. "As you wish." But instead of leaving at once, he glanced, not at Miss Weatherby, but toward the far end of the lawn, where the old yew walk cast a dark green shadow across the grass. It was a glance full of calculation, or apprehension. Then it was gone. He inclined his head and withdrew. Miss Marple watched him until he disappeared. "A capable man," she said. "The most capable I have ever known," said Miss Weatherby. "But not," said Miss Marple in the same mild tone. "An easy one." Miss Weatherby's mouth altered by perhaps the width of a pin. "No," she said, "not easy." When Miss Marple returned to Rosebank Cottage, the evening had deepened. Mrs. Colwell was in the drawing room with a lamplit beside her, and a book open face down on her lap. "Well?" she demanded. Miss Marple removed her gloves. "Very interesting. That means unpleasant. Not necessarily, though I do think your village is under strain." Mrs. Colwell snorted. "Of course it is. You only had to look at the vicar's wife at luncheon yesterday to know that. She smiled like a woman balancing crockery on her head." Miss Marple sat down. "There is a Mr. Edwin Harcourt," she said, "Miss Weatherby's cousin, highly valued, universally respected, very efficient." Mrs. Colwell gave a little grim nod. "Yes, and what did you make of him?" Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. "My dear Lavinia," she said quietly, "he is either a very burdened man or a very frightened one." Mrs. Colwell stared. "Frightened? Of what?" Miss Marple looked toward the darkened window, where the reflection of the room floated faintly over the night outside. "In villages," she said, "people are often frightened of one another, but in very orderly villages they are sometimes frightened of the truth." At that very moment, though neither of them could know it, Edwin Harcourt was alone in his cottage on the edge of the Weatherby estate, standing at his writing desk with one hand pressed flat against a drawer he had locked twice already. Inside it lay several papers, a photograph, and a single sealed envelope addressed in his own hand. He stood there for some time listening. Outside, the village was settling into evening. A gate clicked. Somewhere an owl called. From the hall in the distance came the faint, civilized glow of light at the windows. Larkenby looked as it always did, orderly, lovely, composed. But there are moments when a village seems to hold its breath, and this was one of them. Part 2. A death so gentle. It barely seemed a crime. The next morning dawned with one of those deceptive spring brightnesses that seem to promise innocence to the whole world. The sky above Larkenby was clear and pale, the kind of soft blue one saw in old China. Sparrows hopped along the low stone walls. The church bell rang a neat and reasonable 8:15. Milk stood in shining bottles at cottage doors, and the village, at first glance, appeared no more burdened than any other quiet English place beginning its day. Miss Marple, however, had lived too long among human beings to place confidence in the weather. She was in the breakfast room at Rosebank Cottage with Mrs. Colwell, who was buttering toast with the purposeful air of a woman performing an operation, when the maid came in looking distinctly less composed than usual. "If you please, ma'am," she said to Mrs. Colwell, "there's been a message from the hall." Mrs. Colwell looked up sharply. "What sort of message?" The maid hesitated. "Mr. Harcourt has been taken ill, ma'am. Very sudden, they say." The knife in Mrs. Colwell's hand stopped. "Ill?" "Yes, ma'am. Dr. Fenwick was sent for in the night." Miss Marple, who had been stirring sugar into her tea, let the spoon rest against the cup. "Do they say what is the matter?" she asked. "No, miss. Only that it is serious." Mrs. Colwell dismissed the girl and sat back in her chair. "There," she said in a low voice. "There it is." Miss Marple looked at her. "You expected something?" "I expected trouble. In villages one often does, but I had not supposed it would arrive so soon." Neither woman said much more over breakfast. Indeed, the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that comes when two minds, differently organised but equally alert, begin turning over the same facts. At 9:30, when the postman passed and did not pause as usual for a word at the gate, Mrs. Colwell rose and went to the window. "He did not stop," she said. "No. That means he has already heard something and is carrying it elsewhere." Miss Marple nodded. At 10 o'clock, the truth arrived in the person of Mrs. Baines, the rector's housekeeper, who considered it part of Christian duty to circulate necessary information at the earliest possible moment. She was shown into the drawing room, already flushed from walking and importance. Such a thing, she declared, before anyone had properly invited her to sit down. Such a dreadful thing. Mr. Harcourt is dead. Mrs. Colwell, who believed in encouraging the informative while not appearing too eager, said coolly, "Dead? Yes, indeed. Passed away in the night. Dr. Fenwick says it was the heart." Miss Marple looked up with quiet attention. The heart. So they say. He'd had trouble, it seems, though not many knew. He was found in his chair in the study at his cottage. Peaceful as anything. Miss Weatherby has taken it very hard. Mrs. Colwell said, "Had he been alone?" "Quite alone. His housekeeper had gone home at 8:30, and he was seen later in the evening by Mr. Pritchard, the gardener, passing the lower path near the hall. Then nothing more until this morning, when Mrs. Keene came in and found him." Mrs. Baines lowered her voice, though no one had asked her to. "They say there was a glass of port beside him, and the fire still burning low, like a gentleman in a picture." Mrs. Colwell's expression suggested that dying decoratively was an overrated accomplishment. "And Dr. Fenwick is satisfied." "Oh yes, he attended immediately. He says it was natural. A weakness of the heart brought on by strain, perhaps." So sad. Such a useful man. There it was again, Miss Marple thought. Useful. The word attached itself to Edwin Harcourt as though usefulness were the chief and final measure of his life. After Mrs. Baines had departed, taking with her a promise of prayers and an appetite for additional facts, Mrs. Colwell turned to Miss Marple. "Well?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. She sat very still, her knitting untouched in her lap. "I do not know," she said at last. "It may be entirely natural, but—" Miss Marple lifted her eyes. "People do die naturally every day, yet when a man looks frightened one evening and dies quietly in his chair the same night, one cannot help thinking of other possibilities." Mrs. Colwell gave a sharp nod. "Exactly." By noon, the village had entered that phase of communal mourning which is half sorrow, half observation. Blinds were not drawn because the dead man had not been local enough for that, but voices dropped. Women meeting at the post office exchanged expressions full of regret and small satisfaction at being able to display it. Men on the green spoke with unusual gravity, and beneath all of it ran something deeper, a current of tension not softened by condolence. Larkenby was grieving, yes, but it was also watching itself grieve. Miss Marple, who had no intention of forcing herself where she was not wanted, spent the early afternoon in the garden with her embroidery. Yet even there, fragments of the village drifted toward her. Two women passed the hedge and spoke too low to be fully heard, though one phrase rose clearly, "Always knew too much." Later the butcher's boy paused by the gate to straighten his bicycle chain, and volunteered that Mr. Harcourt had quarrelled with nobody, leastways not openly, which was a distinction Miss Marple appreciated. Toward 3 o'clock, Dr. Fenwick himself appeared. He was shown into the drawing room and greeted with proper sympathy by Mrs. Colwell, who then with unusual tact left him largely to Miss Marple. "I hope," he said, taking the chair offered him, "that I do not intrude." "Not at all, Doctor." He looked tired, though still self-possessed. There was a gravity in him today that sat more naturally than the polished ease of the previous afternoon. "I thought it right to call," he said, "because news travels so quickly in villages, and I would not wish speculation to run ahead of fact." "That is sensible," said Miss Marple. He inclined his head. "Mr. Harcourt died of heart failure. I have no doubt of it medically. He had, as it happens, consulted me privately some months ago. There was weakness there, though he disliked the subject and did not take advice very obediently." "Did he know his condition was serious?" Dr. Fenwick's fingers moved once over the arm of the chair. He knew there was reason for caution, yet he worked hard. Excessively so. Miss Marple regarded him with her clear old eyes. "Doctor, you are very careful." A faint colour touched his face. "Am I?" "Yes, which may only mean that you are a good physician, but sometimes care is not the same thing as certainty." For a moment he was silent. Then he smiled a little, though without amusement. "You have a formidable reputation, Miss Marple." "I have been told a great many things," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Some of them even true." Dr. Fenwick leaned back. Very well. Since you press me, yes. I am medically satisfied. But I admit the circumstances have an unfortunate dramatic quality. A man alone, found by the fire, papers on the desk, a half-finished glass. One sees at once what sort of stories people will begin inventing. And do you think they will invent them because the scene is dramatic, asked Miss Marple, or because there is already unrest in the village? He looked at her directly then, and for the first time she saw something guarded not by manners, but by reluctance. You notice a great deal for a visitor. One notices more sometimes when one is a visitor. A pause followed. At last Dr. Fenwick said, Mr. Harcourt was not universally liked. There are many useful men who are not. No, he gave a brief sigh. He managed to state matters firmly. Tenancies, repairs, rents, permissions, small disputes. He had a hand in all of them. Necessary work, but not the sort that wins affection. He also had a regrettable habit of knowing people's private business. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. In what way? In the village way. Family debts, unhappy marriages, sons who drank too much, daughters receiving letters from unsuitable quarters. He had an eye for weakness. And what did he do with what he knew? The doctor hesitated. Usually, I think, nothing. But knowing in itself can become a sort of power. Yes, said Miss Marple softly, it can. After he had gone, Mrs. Colwell returned and said, Well? Miss Marple repeated the substance of the conversation. Mrs. Colwell was silent for a moment. Then she said, A man who knows everybody's secrets and dies in the night. If that is a natural death. It is an inconveniently timed one. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How very Lavinia that sounds. Don't be absurd, Jane. What will happen now? That depends, said Miss Marple, on whether the dead man left anything behind. In that, though she did not know it yet, she was very near the truth. For Edwin Harcourt had indeed left something behind. Late that same afternoon, in the small stone cottage where he had lived for nearly 12 years, Miss Weatherby stood in his study with Dr. Fenwick and the housekeeper, Mrs. Keene. The room was neat, almost to severity. Shelves of ledgers lined one wall. A coal fire, now grey and fallen in, still gave off a faint warmth. The desk was square, dark, and polished from long use. Miss Weatherby had borne the day with remarkable composure, but there was strain in the angle of her shoulders. Was anything disturbed? She asked. Mrs. Keene twisted her hands in her apron. No, miss, not as I could see. Only, I thought one drawer might have been forced. Dr. Fenwick turned sharply. Forced? Mrs. Keene nodded toward the right side of the desk. I can't be certain, sir, but the key was bent and the drawer sticks now. Mr. Harcourt always kept it locked. Miss Weatherby crossed the room at once. She tried the drawer. It resisted, then opened with a splintering little sound. Inside were papers, neatly stacked, a leather wallet, a packet of letters tied with black ribbon, and an empty space, rectangular, sharply marked in dustless polish. Miss Weatherby stood perfectly still. What was kept there? Asked Dr. Fenwick. I do not know, she said. But the doctor, looking at her face, was not convinced she spoke quite the whole truth. At that moment a shadow crossed the open doorway. Mrs. Dane, who had entered unannounced in her anxiety to be useful, stopped short. Oh, she said, I beg pardon. I did not know. Then she saw the drawer. A most curious expression came over her face. It was gone almost at once, replaced by distress. I only came to ask whether there is anything the rectory can do. Miss Weatherby closed the drawer with deliberate calm. Nothing, thank you. Mrs. Dane murmured something suitable and withdrew. Yet as she passed back down the corridor, her hand went unconsciously to her throat. The household, already unsettled by death, now carried an additional unease that no one named aloud. By evening the rumour had begun, not openly, not in its final form, but in those small suggestive pieces from which village certainty is built. A drawer had been tampered with, a paper was missing. Mr. Harcourt had not died quite so peacefully as first described. He had been worried for days, he had argued with someone on the lane, he had received a letter, he had sent one, he had threatened something, he had known too much. The stories varied, their tone did not. By supper time Larkenby had begun the subtle transformation from shocked village to suspicious village. Miss Marple, sitting by the lamp that night with her knitting and a cup of weak cocoa, felt the shift very plainly. It was not merely that Edwin Harcourt was dead. Death by itself seldom disturbs a community so deeply, unless it strikes at a hidden arrangement. No, what troubled Larkenby was not the fact of his death, but the possibility that he had died at the exact point where too many private lines crossed. Mrs. Colwell looked up from her book. "You are thinking?" "Yes." "That means something disagreeable." "Quite possibly." Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "Lavinia, tell me, who in the village depended most upon Edwin Harcourt?" Mrs. Colwell considered. "Half the place, directly or indirectly. Tenants, tradesmen, the hall, the school governors even. He arranged things, remembered things, controlled access to Miss Weatherby in practical matters. And who disliked him?" Mrs. Colwell gave a short laugh. "That is a different question. People who owe money usually dislike the man who keeps accounts. So do careless husbands, ambitious wives, disappointed sons, and persons who find themselves denied permission to build greenhouses where they shouldn't. Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple, "a man who's useful to everybody and liked by few is often more dangerous dead than alive." Mrs. Colwell stared at her. "My dear Jane, that is an alarming thing to say." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I'm afraid it is." She rose and went to the window. Outside, the village slept under a mild spring moon. The church tower stood white against the dark. Somewhere, very far off, a dog barked once. The surface of Larkenby remained exactly what it had always been. Neat, composed, entirely in order. But Miss Marple had seen villages before in which order was not the opposite of violence. It was only the curtain drawn in front of it. And behind that curtain, she suspected, something had already begun to move. Part 3. The Things People. Almost said. The day after Edwin Harcourt's death did not begin with shock. That had already passed into something quieter, more intricate. Larkenby did not collapse into hysteria or grief. It rearranged itself. Miss Marple, who had always believed that villages behaved rather like living organisms, observed the change with great interest. It was not visible in any one place, but it could be felt everywhere. In the slight hesitation before greetings, in the careful choice of words, in the way doors were shut just a little more firmly than usual. At breakfast, Mrs. Colwell declared, "They are talking." "Yes," said Miss Marple calmly, "but not yet about the same thing." "That will come," Mrs. Colwell replied grimly. "It always does." Miss Marple buttered a piece of toast with delicate precision. "In my experience," she said, "people begin with small certainties, then they add imagination. Finally, they arrive at a truth which has very little to do with either," Mrs. Colwell snorted. "And which part are we at now? Between the first and the second." That morning, Miss Marple decided to walk to the village. It was a deliberate choice. One learned very little sitting still when information was moving, and Larkenby, though outwardly calm, was now alive with quiet currents. She took her usual route past the green, noting as she went who greeted her, and how. Mrs. Baines, for instance, was unusually subdued, though her eyes shone with suppressed activity. The butcher inclined his head but did not volunteer any news. Two young women outside the post office stopped speaking entirely as Miss Marple approached, then resumed with unnatural brightness once she'd passed. It was all very instructive. At the post office itself, Miss Marple found Mrs. Dane. The rector's sister stood at the counter with a small parcel, speaking to the postmistress in a tone that was meant to sound normal and did not quite succeed. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said quickly, turning. "Good morning. Such a sad business." "Very sad indeed." Mrs. Dane lowered her voice at once, though no one had prompted her. "One hardly knows what to think." "Do you not?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Dane gave a small, nervous laugh. "Well, of course, Dr. Fenwick says it was the heart, and I am sure he knows best. Only—" She stopped. Miss Marple waited. "Only what?" "Oh, nothing," said Mrs. Dane hastily. "Nothing at all. It is merely that Mr. Harcourt did not seem— one does not expect—" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. Mrs. Dane leaned closer. "He did not seem like a man who would die quietly," she whispered. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her with mild interest. No, he was always so contained, as though he were holding something in." She shivered slightly. People like that do not simply sit down and die. They do something else. Mrs. Dane drew back quickly. Oh, I should not say such things. It is most improper. Yes, said Miss Marple, but often very revealing. Miss Marple left the post office with a small packet of wool she did not need and walked slowly toward the churchyard. It was a place she had always found useful. Graveyards, she reflected, had a way of encouraging honesty, not in the living, who often behaved as convention demanded, but in the observer who was reminded that human arrangements, however intricate, tended to end in a rather simple fashion. The churchyard at Larkenby was well kept, of course. Paths were swept, stones were straight, even the older graves had been carefully restored, as though the village would not permit disorder even among its dead. And there, near the low wall, stood Mr. Pritchard, the gardener. He was a stooped man with hands permanently marked by soil and weather. At present, he was trimming the edge of a path with great attention, though Miss Marple suspected he had already done it once that morning. "Good morning," she said. He looked up, touched his cap and nodded. "Morning, miss. A fine day." "Aye." She stood for a moment watching him work. "I understand you saw Mr. Harcourt the night before he died." "Mr." Pritchard's shears paused. "Who told you that?" "In a village. One hears things." He resumed cutting, though less steadily. "Aye, I saw him." "On the lower path?" "That's right." "What time was that?" "Near 9, I'd say." Miss Marple folded her hands over her umbrella. "Was he alone?" "Aye." "And did he seem well?" Mr. Pritchard hesitated. "Well enough," he said at last. "That is not quite the same as well," Miss Marple observed. "He shifted his weight. He were walking fast. In what direction? Toward his cottage. And did he speak to you?" "A word or two." "What did he say?" Mr. Pritchard wiped his hand slowly on his trousers. "He asked if I'd seen anyone about." "Anyone in particular?" "No." Miss Marple's voice remained very gentle. "Was that usual?" The gardener shook his head. "No, miss. Or not for him." "What did you say?" "I told him no. There weren't no one about." "And then?" He went on. Miss Marple watched him closely. "Did he appear relieved?" Mr. Pritchard gave a short, uneasy laugh. "No, miss, he didn't." There was a pause. Miss Marple said, "What did he appear then?" The man looked down at the path he had been trimming. "Like a man listening," he said quietly. Miss Marple did not speak again at once. She thanked him and moved on, leaving him to his work. A man listening. It was an interesting phrase. By the time she returned to Rosebank Cottage, the village had grown even more subdued. Something was forming now, not yet spoken aloud, but gathering shape. Mrs. Colwell met her in the hall. "You've been out long enough to hear something," she said. Miss Marple removed her gloves. "Yes." "Well?" "Mr. Harcourt was not at ease the night he died. That we already suspected. He was looking for someone, or fearing someone." Mrs. Colwell's expression sharpened. "Ah. And there is more. A drawer in his desk was forced. I have heard that too. Something is missing." Mrs. Colwell leaned forward slightly. "And what do you suppose it was?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Lavinia, if one knew that, one would know a great deal more besides." That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Miss Honoria Weatherby arrived at Rosebank Cottage without prior notice, a breach of her usual habits, which alone would have been enough to make Mrs. Colwell suspicious. She was shown into the drawing-room, where she greeted Miss Marple with composed courtesy. "I hope I do not intrude." "Not at all," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Colwell, sensing importance, and remained. Miss Weatherby did not sit at once. She stood by the window, her hands lightly clasped. "I have come," she said, "because I believe you are a woman who understands certain things." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I understand very little, but I observe what I can." "That is precisely why I wish to speak to you." She turned then, and though her face remained controlled, there was something beneath it, something strained, and perhaps even uncertain. "There is talk in the village," she said. "I should like it to stop." "That is not always possible." "No," said Miss Weatherby, "but it may be guided." Mrs. Colwell made a small disapproving sound. Miss Marple said quietly, "What is it you wish to be said, Miss Weatherby?" "That Mr. Harcourt died of natural causes, that there is nothing to be concerned about, that the village may continue as before, and can it? Miss Weatherby met her gaze directly. It must. There was a long pause. Miss Marple said, "You're a practical woman." "I have had to be." "And yet," Miss Marple continued, "you came here in person, rather than sending a message. That suggests that something troubles you beyond mere gossip." Miss Weatherby's hands tightened slightly. "There was a paper," she said at last. "Something Mr. Harcourt kept. It is no longer in his possession." "A paper of importance?" "Yes." "To whom?" Miss Weatherby hesitated. "To several people." Mrs. Colwell let out a quiet exclamation. "Blackmail?" she said bluntly. Miss Weatherby did not answer immediately. Then she said, "I would not use that word." "Why not?" asked Mrs. Colwell. "Because it suggests something crude," Miss Weatherby replied. This was not crude. It was precise. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her thoughtfully. "A record of secrets," she said. Miss Weatherby gave the faintest nod. "Yes." "And now it is gone?" "Yes." "And you do not know who has it?" "No." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then the village will not be at ease until it is found." Miss Weatherby's voice hardened slightly. "The village must learn to be at ease." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Miss Weatherby, villagers do not learn such things. They either know them, or they fear." Miss Weatherby stood very still. "Then," she said quietly, "I suppose we must discover which it is." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said, "I think we must." Outside, beyond the neatly trimmed hedges and polished windows, Larkenby remained as perfect as ever. But now, beneath that perfection, something had begun to move with purpose, a missing paper, a frightened man, a death that looked too gentle, and somewhere, in the quiet order of the village, a truth waiting not to be found, but to be revealed. Part 4. The paper that should not exist. By the 4th day after Edwin Harcourt's death, Larkenby had begun to divide, not openly, not in any way that could be named at the tea table or acknowledged at the church door, but in that subtle, unmistakable manner by which communities sort themselves when something dangerous lies between them. There were those who wished to forget, and there were those who could not. Miss Marple, sitting with her knitting by the window at Rosebank Cottage, observed this division with quiet clarity. It was there in the way people greeted one another, some too warmly, others too carefully. It was there in the lowered voices, in the sudden changes of subject, in the faint but persistent awareness that something unseen was being carried from one house to another. "The village is thinking," she said aloud. Mrs. Colwell, who was writing letters at a small desk, did not look up. That is never a comfortable process. "No," said Miss Marple, "particularly when it thinks in different directions at once." "What do you mean?" Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "Some people are asking what happened. Others are asking what will happen next. Those are not the same question." Mrs. Colwell considered that. "And which is the more dangerous?" "The second," said Miss Marple. "Always the second." That afternoon, Miss Marple received a note. It was delivered by hand, another small irregularity in a village where the post was perfectly efficient. The envelope bore no name beyond her own, written in a firm but unfamiliar hand. Inside was a single line: "If you wish to understand Mr. Harcourt, come to the churchyard at 6. There was no signature. Miss Marple read it twice, then placed it calmly beside her teacup. Mrs. Colwell, who had been watching with narrowed eyes, said, "Well?" "I have been invited for a walk." "By whom?" "I am not told." Mrs. Colwell made an impatient gesture. "You are not seriously considering going?" "My dear Lavinia," said Miss Marple, "when someone offers information, it is usually unwise to refuse it. It may be a trap." "It may be," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "but traps are often as revealing as truths." At 5 minutes to 6 she set out. The evening was soft and still, the kind that wraps a village in quiet so complete that even footsteps seem deliberate. The churchyard lay in gentle shadow, the last light catching the tops of the headstones and leaving the lower ground dim. Miss Marple entered by the small side gate and walked slowly along the path. For a few moments she appeared to be alone. Then a figure detached itself from the deeper shadow near the yew trees. It was Mrs. Dane. She came forward quickly, her hands clasped tightly together, her expression both determined and uneasy. "I'm so glad you came," she said in a low voice. Miss Marple inclined her head. "You wish to speak to me?" "Yes, but not in the village. Not where anyone might overhear." "That is understandable." Mrs. Dane glanced over her shoulder, though there was no one in sight. "I should not be doing this," she said. "It is not my place, but I cannot bear it any longer." Miss Marple waited. "It's about Mr. Harcourt," Mrs. Dane continued, "and that paper. You know what it was?" Mrs. Dane hesitated. "Not exactly, but I know enough." "Then perhaps you will tell me what you do know." Mrs. Dane drew a breath as though steadying herself. "He kept records," she said. "Not official ones, those were always in order, but private ones. Things people would not wish to be written down, such as debts, disagreements, small scandals, matters of reputation." Her voice dropped further. "Things that could ruin a person if they became known." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "And you are certain of this?" "Yes, I saw it once." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "When?" "Some months ago. Or I had gone to his cottage on an errand for the rector, something quite trivial. He was not there, and Mrs. Keene allowed me to wait in the study. I did not mean to pry, but the drawer was open, just a little, and she faltered. "You looked," said Miss Marple gently. "Yes." "And what did you see?" Mrs. Dane's voice trembled. "Names, dates, notes written in a hand that was very precise and very cold. Not judgments, he didn't write like that, but facts, or what he considered facts." "About whom?" Mrs. Dane gave a faint, helpless gesture. "About people in the village." "All of them?" "I cannot say, but enough to make me feel—" She broke off. "Uncomfortable?" suggested Miss Marple. "Yes. No. More than that. Afraid." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Afraid of Mr. Harcourt?" Mrs. Dane shook her head quickly. "No, not exactly. He was never unkind to me, but there was something in the way he looked at people, as though he knew what they would prefer him not to know. That is often unsettling. Yes," she hesitated again. "And there was something else." "Yes?" "One page. I didn't read it fully, but I saw a name I recognised, and beside it, a note that did not seem like the others." "In what way?" "It was underlined, and there was a date, a recent one." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Whose name?" Mrs. Dane looked at her, her face pale even in the dim light. "Miss Weatherby's." There was a long pause. Miss Marple said quietly, "Are you certain?" "Yes." "And the note?" "I could not read all of it. Only a few words." "What words?" Mrs. Dane swallowed. "Not to be repeated, not yet." The silence that followed seemed to deepen the shadows around them. Miss Marple said, "You did not tell anyone of this at the time?" "No. I felt ashamed for having seen it at all, and it did not seem my business." Mrs. Dane's voice shook slightly. "But now the paper is gone, and Mr. Harcourt is dead, and people are beginning to talk. I thought, perhaps, you would know what to do." Miss Marple did not answer at once. She was looking not at Mrs. Dane, but at the ground, as though arranging the pieces of something only she could see. At last she said, "You have done quite right to tell me." "Have I?" "Yes." Mrs. Dane gave a small, uncertain sigh. "I only wish I understood it." Miss Marple lifted her eyes. "My dear Mrs. Dane, understanding often comes later. First one must notice." They left the churchyard together, though they parted at the gate, each taking a different direction. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward Rosebank Cottage, her mind very active. A record of secrets, a missing paper, a note beside Miss Weatherby's name, and a man who had died just as the possibility of exposure became real. By the time she reached the gate, the lamps in the village had begun to glow softly behind drawn curtains. Inside, Mrs. Colwell was waiting. "Well?" she demanded. Miss Marple removed her hat and set it aside. "The paper," she said, "was exactly what we suspected." "A list?" "Yes, a careful one." Mrs. Colwell gave a sharp nod. "And now it is missing." "Yes." "Then someone has it." "Yes." Mrs. Colwell leaned forward. "Who?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Lavinia, if one knew that, one would also know whether Mr. Harcourt died of his heart or of something else." Mrs. Colwell frowned. "You do not believe it was natural?" Miss Marple went to the window. Outside, Larkenby lay in quiet order, its houses neat, its streets still, its appearance entirely undisturbed. "I believe," she said slowly, that when a man keeps a record of other people's secrets, he places himself in a very delicate position. And that when such a record disappears at the exact moment of his death, it is rarely a coincidence. Mrs. Colwell was silent. Miss Marple turned back. "There is one more thing," she said. "Yes?" "The note beside Miss Weatherby's name." Mrs. Colwell's eyes sharpened. "What about it?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "It suggests that whatever Mr. Harcourt knew about her, he had not yet decided what to do with it." "And now?" Miss Marple's expression grew very thoughtful. "Now," she said quietly, "someone else may have that decision to make." Outside, beyond the calm and order of Larkenby, the night settled gently, but within the village something had shifted again. The secret was no longer hidden, it had simply changed hands. Part 5. The people who had something to lose. By the 5th day, Larkenby had stopped pretending. Not openly, no one would have admitted it, but the careful politeness, the slightly exaggerated normality, the deliberate calm of the past few days had begun to crack in small, revealing ways. Voices rose a fraction too quickly, doors closed a fraction too sharply, and the most telling sign of all, people began watching one another. Miss Marple, who had seen such changes before, recognised the moment at once. "The village has moved from curiosity to fear," she said, as she sat with Mrs. Colwell over the morning tea. Mrs. Colwell poured with unnecessary firmness. "Good," she replied. "Fear makes people careless." "Yes," said Miss Marple mildly, "but not always in the way one expects." "And what do you expect?" Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "I expect that whoever has Mr. Harcourt's paper now understands its value." Mrs. Colwell leaned forward. "And will use it?" "Possibly, or possibly not. That depends on what sort of person has it." Mrs. Colwell gave a sharp little laugh. "In a village like this, Jane, that could mean anyone." Miss Marple looked at her over the rim of her cup. "My dear Lavinia," she said softly, "it always does." That morning, Miss Marple chose not to go out immediately. Instead, she sat by the window and watched. It was a habit she'd cultivated over many years, not merely observing movement, being braced, but observing patterns. Who passed at what hour? Who paused, and where? Who avoided certain routes? Who seemed to have acquired a sudden interest in matters previously beneath their notice? By 11 o'clock she had noticed 3 things. First, Mrs. Dane had not left the rectory grounds. Second, Dr. Fenwick had passed the lane twice, both times walking faster than his usual measured pace. Third, Miss Weatherby's car had not moved, though visitors had begun arriving at the hall. "Interesting," murmured Miss Marple. Mrs. Colwell, who had no patience for silent deductions, said, "What is?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People are positioning themselves." "For what?" "For what comes next." It came sooner than either of them expected. Just after noon, a small disturbance occurred in the village street. Not dramatic, not loud, but enough to draw attention. A young man had come from the direction of the lower cottages and was speaking in an agitated tone to the postmaster. Several others had gathered, not close enough to seem curious, but near enough to hear. Miss Marple, arriving a few minutes later, paused beside the window display of envelopes and ink. "What has happened?" she asked gently. The postmistress, who had already heard twice as much as she could properly repeat, leaned forward. "It's Mr. Thomas Ridley," she whispered, "from the blacksmith's house. He says he's received a letter." "A letter?" "Yes. No name, only a message." Miss Marple's interest sharpened slightly. "What sort of message?" The postmistress lowered her voice further. "Something about a debt. Something he would not wish spoken of." Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the letter, was it signed?" "No." "And when did he receive it?" "This morning." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside. Mr. Ridley was still there, a broad-shouldered young man with the look of someone who had always relied on strength rather than subtlety. At present, however, he looked distinctly unsettled. "It's nonsense," he was saying loudly. "Complete nonsense." "No doubt," said Miss Marple pleasantly. He turned, slightly startled. "Oh, good morning." "You have received an unpleasant letter, I understand," he shifted. "It's nothing." "Most unpleasant letters are described in that way," said Miss Marple. "May I ask what it contained?" He hesitated. "Just something about money. Old business, not worth mentioning." And yet it was worth writing. He did not answer. Miss Marple regarded him quietly. Was there a request? She asked. He swallowed. A suggestion, he admitted, that it would be better if certain matters remained quiet. Miss Marple inclined her head. And did the letter suggest how that might be arranged? Mr. Ridley looked away. Yes. Money? Yes. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Thank you, she said. You have been very helpful. He gave a short, uneasy laugh. I don't see how. But Miss Marple had already turned away. When she returned to Rosebank Cottage, Mrs. Colwell was waiting. Well? She demanded. Miss Marple removed her gloves. The paper has begun to speak. Mrs. Colwell's eyes lit with fierce satisfaction. Blackmail, then? It would appear so. Who is doing it? Miss Marple sat down. That is the question. They did not have long to wait for further developments. By mid-afternoon, 2 more incidents had occurred, both quiet, both private, but both, in a village like Larkenby, impossible to conceal. Mrs. Baines had received a note and burned it immediately, though not before being seen doing so, and Dr. Fenwick, returning from his rounds, had found an envelope waiting on his desk. He did not speak of it, but he did not deny it either. That evening Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Colwell in the drawing-room, the lamp casting a soft circle of light between them. It is very efficient, said Mrs. Colwell, almost admirable. Yes, said Miss Marple, that is what troubles me. Why? Because true blackmail is rarely efficient. It is usually clumsy, emotional, or greedy. This, she paused, this is something else. Mrs. Colwell frowned. What do you mean? Miss Marple folded her hands. The letters are precise, targeted. They do not demand too much. They do not threaten openly. They suggest. And that is worse. In some ways, yes. Mrs. Colwell leaned forward. Jane, whoever has that paper is controlling the village. Yes. And you're sitting here discussing it calmly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Lavinia, panic has never solved anything. Understanding often does. And do you understand? Miss Marple was silent for a moment. Partly, she said. Well? There are only 2 possibilities. Mrs. Colwell waited. Either Mr. Harcourt was already using the paper before his death, or someone else has taken it up and is using it in a way he never intended. Mrs. Colwell stared at her. Which do you believe? Miss Marple looked toward the window where the village lay quiet under the evening sky. I believe, she said slowly, that the second possibility is the more dangerous. That same evening in Wetherby Hall, Miss Honoria Wetherby sat alone in the study. The room was large, ordered, and very still. On the desk before her lay a single envelope. She had not opened it. She did not need to. She knew exactly what it contained. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the desk, but there was tension in them, a restraint held with effort. After a long moment, she rose and crossed the room. She did not ring for a servant. Instead, she went to the door, opened it herself, and stepped into the corridor. Have Mr. Fenwick come to me? She said to the passing maid. Yes, miss. Miss Wetherby returned to the study and stood by the window. Outside, the grounds lay in perfect order. Inside, something had begun to unravel. An hour later, Dr. Fenwick arrived. He entered without ceremony. You sent for me? Yes. He closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Miss Wetherby said, You have received a letter. It was not a question. Dr. Fenwick inclined his head. Yes. And? And what? What does it say? He regarded her carefully. Very little, and very much. Miss Wetherby's gaze did not waver. Do you intend to comply? Dr. Fenwick gave a faint, tired smile. That depends. On what? On whether the person who sent it knows as much as they claim. Miss Wetherby was silent. Then she said, And do they? Dr. Fenwick's expression hardened slightly. That, he said, is what we must discover. Back at Rosebank Cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window once more. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The village is being tested, she said softly. Mrs. Colwell looked up. Tested? Yes? In what way? Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. To see who will yield, and who will resist. Mrs. Colwell shivered slightly. And what happens then? Miss Marple's voice was very calm. Then, she said, we shall see who has the most to lose. Outside, Larkenby remained perfect. But now, beneath its quiet surface, fear had taken root, and it was beginning to grow. Part 6. The night something broke. By the 6th day, the tension in Larkenby had ceased to be subtle. It was no longer confined to glances and half-spoken remarks. It had entered the air itself, like a storm that had not yet broken, but had already made breathing uncomfortable. Miss Marple noticed it the moment she stepped outside that morning. The village looked unchanged. The same neat hedges, the same clean windows, the same orderly rhythm of life. But something essential had shifted. People no longer pretended not to see one another. They watched openly now, and more importantly, they listened. "My dear," said Mrs. Colwell from behind her, "if you stand there any longer looking philosophical, the entire village will decide you know something." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That would not be entirely inaccurate." Mrs. Colwell raised her eyebrows. "You're getting somewhere, then?" "I believe so." "Well?" Miss Marple turned back into the house. "There is something wrong with the pattern." Mrs. Colwell frowned. "What pattern?" "The letters," said Miss Marple. "The blackmail." Mrs. Colwell sat down abruptly. "Wrong how? It seems perfectly clear to me. Someone has the paper and is using it." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "But not in the way one would expect." "How else would one use such a thing?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "With greed, with urgency, with carelessness. But this is measured. Almost restrained." Mrs. Colwell stared. "You're suggesting our blackmailer has principles?" "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "I am suggesting that our blackmailer has a purpose beyond money." That afternoon brought confirmation. A second confrontation occurred in the village, this time more visible, more difficult to ignore. It took place outside the small grocer's shop. Miss Marple, arriving just in time to observe, saw Dr. Fenwick speaking to Mrs. Baines in a tone that was firm, almost sharp. "I must insist," he was saying, "that you say nothing of this." Mrs. Baines, flushed and indignant, replied, "I have said nothing improper, Doctor. But one cannot be expected to ignore such things entirely. These are not matters for general discussion." "They have already become so," Miss Marple approached quietly. "Good afternoon," she said. Both turned. Dr. Fenwick recovered himself quickly. "Miss Marple, forgive me, this is not a private matter," she suggested gently. "Yes. Then I shall not intrude." But Mrs. Baines, whose sense of importance had been fully awakened, said eagerly, "It is about the letters, miss." Dr. Fenwick's expression tightened. "Mrs. Baines?" Miss Marple looked from one to the other. "The letters are causing distress," she said calmly. "That is understandable." "They are causing more than distress," Mrs. Baines said. "They are turning people against one another." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "And that," she said, "is often the true aim." "Doctor." Fenwick's eyes met hers sharply. "You believe this is deliberate?" Miss Marple held his gaze. "I believe," she said, "that whoever is writing these letters understands human nature very well." There was a moment of silence. Then Dr. Fenwick said quietly, "Yes." That evening Miss Marple did something unusual. She left the house after dark. Mrs. Colwell, upon discovering this, was scandalised. "Jane, at your age, wandering about at night." "My dear Lavinia," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "one must occasionally place oneself where events are likely to occur." "And where is that?" Miss Marple took her shawl. "Near the place where Mr. Harcourt died." The path to Harcourt's cottage lay beyond the hall, past the lower gardens and into a quieter stretch of land where the village thinned into fields and hedgerows. At night it felt different, near less ordered, less certain. Miss Marple walked slowly, her steps careful but steady. She did not expect to find anything obvious. She expected rather to notice something out of place, and she did. The cottage stood dark, its windows unlit, its door firmly closed. But the ground outside told a different story. The gravel path, usually neat, showed signs of the recent disturbance. Footprints, more than one set. Miss Marple bent slightly, examining them. Not fresh, but not old either. Someone had been here since the death. More than once. She straightened slowly. "Interesting," she murmured. At that moment a sound reached her. Soft. Close. A movement near the side of the cottage. Miss Marple did not turn immediately. Instead, she waited. The sound came again, a faint scrape, as of something brushing against wood. Then a voice, low, urgent. "You shouldn't be here." Miss Marple turned. A figure stood in the shadow near the wall. For a moment it was only a shape. Then it stepped slightly forward. Mrs. Dane. Her face was pale, her expression strained. "Mrs. Dane," said Miss Marple calmly, "you are out late." "So are you." "Yes." There was a pause. Mrs. Dane's hands were tightly clasped. "You must go back," she said. "This is not safe." Miss Marple regarded her quietly. "Why not?" Mrs. Dane hesitated. Because someone else may come. Someone who's been here before." Mrs. Dane looked away. "I don't know." Miss Marple stepped a little closer. "My dear Mrs. Dane, you do know something." Mrs. Dane's voice trembled. "I came because I thought perhaps the paper might still be here." "In the cottage?" "Yes. And is it?" Mrs. Dane shook her head quickly. "No." "Then you have already looked." A silence. Then very quietly, "Yes." Miss Marple nodded. "That was not wise." "I know. Did you find anything?" Mrs. Dane hesitated. "Not the paper." "But something else?" Her eyes lifted, filled with uncertainty. "Yes." "What?" Mrs. Dane swallowed. "A second drawer." Miss Marple's attention sharpened instantly. "A second drawer?" "Yes, hidden behind the first. And inside it—" Mrs. Dane's voice dropped to almost nothing. "Nothing." Miss Marple did not move. "Nothing?" she repeated. "Yes. But it had been used." "How do you know?" "There was dust around it, but not inside." Miss Marple was very still. "And you are certain it was empty?" Mrs. Dane nodded. "Yes." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the cottage. A hidden drawer, an empty space, a missing paper, and a man who had died too conveniently. And at last she said softly, "Thank you." Mrs. Dane looked at her anxiously. "What does it mean?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. "It means," she said, "that the paper we are looking for may not be the only one that existed." They left the cottage together, though neither spoke much. At the gate, Mrs. Dane paused. "Miss Marple," she said, "do you think Mr. Harcourt was killed?" Miss Marple looked at her. "In villages," she said gently, "people are rarely killed for what they have done." Mrs. Dane frowned. "Then for what?" Miss Marple's eyes were very clear. "For what they know." Back at Rosebank Cottage, Mrs. Colwell was waiting with impatience. "Well?" Miss Marple removed her shawl. "There was a second drawer." Mrs. Colwell stared. "A second? Hidden and empty." Mrs. Colwell sat down heavily. "Good heavens!" Miss Marple moved to the window. "My dear Lavinia," she said quietly, "we have been asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" "We have been asking who has the paper." "Yes." Miss Marple turned. "But we should have been asking," she paused, "what has already been taken from it?" Outside, the night deepened. Larkenby lay silent. But the silence was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. Because something had changed. The secret was no longer just hidden. It was no longer just dangerous. Now, it was incomplete. Part 7. The Truth That Chose Its Moment. By the 7th day, Larkenby had reached a point from which it could not retreat. The strain, which had once been delicate and hidden beneath politeness, now pressed visibly upon everything. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. Doors were opened cautiously. Even the smallest interactions carried weight, as though each word might tip something already dangerously balanced. Miss Marple, sitting quietly at Rosebank Cottage, had ceased merely observing. Now she was waiting. "My dear Jane," said Mrs. Colwell impatiently, "you have that expression again." "What expression?" "The one that suggests you know something you are not telling me." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I do not yet know everything." "But enough?" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "Enough." Mrs. Colwell leaned forward. "Well then, who is it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she rose and went to the window, looking out over the neat, composed village. "Lavinia," she said softly, "tell me, what do people fear most?" Mrs. Colwell frowned. "Exposure, I suppose. Scandal. Loss of reputation." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And what do they do when they fear such things?" "They hide them." "Or," said Miss Marple, turning back, "they attempt to control them." Mrs. Colwell's eyes sharpened. "You mean—" I mean that the person writing those letters is not simply threatening the village, she paused. They are managing it. That afternoon, Miss Marple sent 3 messages, one to Dr. Fenwick, one to Mrs. Dane, and one to Miss Honoria Weatherby. Each was brief. Each requested their presence at Weatherby Hall that evening. Mrs. Colwell watched her do it with mounting curiosity. You are gathering them, she said. Yes. Why? Miss Marple folded the last note. Because, she said calmly, it is time. Weatherby Hall that evening was as composed as ever. The lamps were lit, the drawing-room arranged, tea prepared with its usual precision. And yet the atmosphere was unmistakably different. Dr. Fenwick arrived first, his expression controlled but strained. Mrs. Dane followed, pale and uncertain. Miss Weatherby was already present, standing near the fireplace, her posture straight, her face unreadable. Mrs. Colwell accompanied Miss Marple, though she made no attempt to hide her keen anticipation. When they were all assembled, Miss Marple took a seat. For a moment no one spoke. Then she said, very gently, "Thank you for coming." Miss Weatherby inclined her head. "You suggested it was important." "It is." Dr. Fenwick crossed his arms. "I assume this concerns the letters?" "Yes." "And Mr. Harcourt," added Mrs. Dane softly. "Yes." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "There are several things we now know," she began. "Mr. Harcourt kept a private record of certain matters, details of people's lives that could, if revealed, cause distress." No one interrupted. "That record has disappeared. Since then, letters have been sent to various individuals, referring to those same matters," Dr. Fenwick said quietly. "Blackmail." Miss Marple shook her head slightly. "Not exactly." Mrs. Colwell made an impatient sound. "Really, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "True blackmail is greedy. It demands quickly and often unwisely. These letters do not. They are careful, selective." She paused. "They do not seek to expose the village," her voice softened. "They seek to control it." There was a silence. Miss Weatherby spoke. "And you believe you know who is responsible?" "Yes." Dr. Fenwick's voice was steady. "Then I suggest you tell us." Miss Marple looked at him. "I will." She paused again, just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. "Mr. Harcourt was not killed," she said. Mrs. Dane gasped slightly. Dr. Fenwick frowned. "You're certain?" "Yes. But he died of his heart," Miss Marple continued calmly. "But not simply of illness. He died because he was afraid." A quiet tension filled the room. "Afraid of what?" asked Mrs. Dane. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly across them. "Afraid of losing control." Miss Weatherby's gaze sharpened slightly. "Explain." Miss Marple inclined her head. Mr. Harcourt's record was not merely a list of secrets. It was a system, a way of managing the village, of ensuring that certain matters remained contained, certain people behaved as expected, certain difficulties did not become public. Mrs. Colwell muttered, "Efficient devil." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Very efficient." She turned slightly toward Dr. Fenwick. "You said he knew people's weaknesses." "Yes." "And that knowledge gave him power." Dr. Fenwick nodded slowly. "Yes," Miss Marple continued. "But power of that sort requires control, and control can be lost." She looked now at Mrs. Dane. "You saw a note beside Miss Weatherby's name?" Mrs. Dane nodded nervously. "Yes. Not to be repeated, not yet." Miss Weatherby did not move, but something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple went on. "That suggests that Mr. Harcourt had discovered something significant, something he had not yet acted upon." Dr. Fenwick said quietly, "And you believe that frightened him?" "Yes. Why?" Miss Marple's voice was very calm. "Because whatever he discovered was not something he could easily control." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple said very gently, "The letters we have seen since his death are not new." Everyone looked at her. "What do you mean?" asked Mrs. Colwell. Miss Marple met her gaze. "I mean that Mr. Harcourt had already begun writing them." A silence fell. Dr. Fenwick spoke first. "That is impossible. The letters appeared after his death." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but they were prepared before it." Mrs. Dane stared. "Prepared?" "Yes, written, arranged, perhaps even scheduled." Miss Weatherby's voice was very quiet. "You are suggesting—" "What exactly?" Miss Marple turned to her. "I am suggesting that Mr. Harcourt, sensing that his control was slipping, Attempted to secure it permanently. Mrs. Colwell leaned forward. By blackmailing the entire village? By reminding it, said Miss Marple, of what he knew. Doctor. Fenwick's expression darkened. But if he is dead, who is sending them now? Miss Marple's answer came gently. No one. A stunned silence followed. Mrs. Dane whispered, But how? Miss Marple explained. He prepared them in advance, left instructions, arranged for their delivery, perhaps through the post, perhaps through some intermediary who does not even understand their full meaning. Dr. Fenwick's voice was sharp. You have proof of this? Miss Marple inclined her head. The hidden drawer? They stared at her. The second drawer, she continued, contained nothing, but it had been used. It likely held the prepared letters. Mrs. Colwell's eyes widened. And someone took them? Yes. Miss Weatherby spoke, her voice controlled. Who? Miss Marple looked at her. That, she said quietly, is the final piece. The room seemed to tighten around them. Miss Marple rose slowly. The person who took those letters did not create them, she said. They only found them. And decided to continue sending them, said Dr. Fenwick. Yes. Why? Miss Marple's eyes were very clear. Because stopping them would raise questions. Mrs. Dane whispered. Questions about what? Miss Marple looked at Miss Weatherby. About what Mr. Harcourt had discovered. A long silence followed. Miss Weatherby did not speak. She did not move. But something in the room had shifted entirely. Miss Marple's voice softened. You went to the cottage, she said, after his death. Miss Weatherby's eyes met hers. Yes. You found the letters. Yes. And you took them. Another pause. Then, yes. Mrs. Dane gasped. Dr. Fenwick stepped forward slightly. Miss Weatherby, she raised a hand. Do not interrupt. Her voice was calm, but beneath it something trembled. Miss Marple watched her gently. You continued sending them. Yes. Why? Miss Weatherby's answer came slowly. Because if I had not, someone else would have asked why they stopped. Miss Marple nodded. And because you feared what was written about you. A faint, bitter smile touched Miss Weatherby's lips. Yes. Mrs. Colwell leaned forward. And what was written? Miss Weatherby's gaze did not waver. That, she said quietly, is not for general discussion. Miss Marple inclined her head. No, it is not. The room fell silent again. At last Miss Marple spoke. Mr. Harcourt died of fear, she said softly. Fear of losing control, fear of what he had uncovered, and fear of what might happen if it were known. She paused. But he was not murdered, Dr. Fenwick exhaled slowly. And the letters? Miss Marple smiled faintly. They may now cease. All eyes turned to Miss Weatherby. She stood very still. Then, after a moment, They will, she said. Outside, the night lay quiet over Larkenby, but something had changed. The fear that had gripped the village was loosening. Not gone, but understood. And in villages, Miss Marple reflected, understanding is often the beginning of peace, even when the truth is not spoken aloud, especially then. Part 8. A Perfect Village, Imperfectly Saved. The following morning, Larkenby woke as it always did. The milk was delivered. The church bell rang. Curtains were drawn back with quiet regularity. The postman made his rounds with steady footsteps and a polite nod for those who noticed him. Nothing appeared altered. And yet, everything was. Miss Marple, seated by the window at Rosebank Cottage, observed the village with her usual calm attention. But there was a difference now. The tension that had stretched across Larkenby like an invisible thread had slackened. Not entirely, not completely, but enough. "My dear Jane," said Mrs. Colwell, lowering her teacup, "I do not understand how everything can look so normal after last night." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Lavinia, villagers are very skilled at returning to normal. But nothing is normal." "No," said Miss Marple gently, "but it is acceptable." Mrs. Colwell gave a small, dissatisfied sound. "That is not the same thing." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it is often enough." Word had not spread. Or rather, it had, but not in the way one might expect. There had been no dramatic revelation, no scandal, no public exposure. No one in Larkenby would have been able to say exactly what had happened at Wetherby Hall the previous evening. And yet, as the day unfolded, there was a subtle shift in behaviour, small, telling adjustments. Mrs. Baines spoke less. Mr. Ridley no longer lingered unnecessarily in the street. Dr. Fenwick resumed his rounds with something closer to his former composure, and Miss Weatherby was seen walking in her garden, as she always did, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. The letters stopped, not abruptly, not with any announcement, but quietly, as though they had never existed at all. By late afternoon, Miss Marple and Mrs. Colwell took a walk. It was a deliberate act, one of those small rituals that restore order not by force but by repetition. They passed the green, where children played again without being called indoors too soon. They passed the post office, where conversation, though still measured, had regained its ordinary rhythm. "They have decided not to know," said Mrs. Colwell. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it is often the most comfortable decision. And Miss Weatherby," Miss Marple considered, "she has decided something as well." "What?" "That the village is more important than the truth." Mrs. Colwell frowned. "And you approve of that?" Miss Marple's voice was very calm. "I understand it." They turned toward the churchyard. The evening light lay softly across the stones, and the air carried that quiet stillness that comes at the end of a long, difficult day. Near the far wall stood Dr. Fenwick. He was alone, his hands clasped behind his back, looking down at one of the older graves. As Miss Marple approached, he turned. "Miss Marple, Doctor," he hesitated slightly, "I wish to speak with you." "Yes?" He drew a breath. "You're certain," he said, "that Mr. Harcourt died of his heart?" Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Yes, and not otherwise?" "No." Dr. Fenwick nodded slowly. "Then I am relieved." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Are you?" He met her gaze. "Yes." There was a pause. Then Miss Marple said gently, "You were one of the people he knew something about." Dr. Fenwick did not deny it. "Yes." "And you feared what might be revealed?" "Yes." Miss Marple nodded. "That is very human." He gave a faint, tired smile. "I am not sure it is very admirable." "Humanity rarely is," said Miss Marple kindly. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Dr. Fenwick said, Miss Weatherby will say nothing." "No, and neither will you." Miss Marple smiled. "I have nothing to say." He looked at her carefully. "You know what was written about her." Miss Marple's eyes were clear. "I know that it troubled Mr. Harcourt." "And that does not trouble you?" Miss Marple considered. "My dear doctor," she said softly, "there are many truths in this world. Some illuminate, others destroy. And this one?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the hall, visible beyond the trees. "This one," she said, "has been put away." As they left the churchyard, Mrs. Colwell spoke at last. "I dislike it," she said. "Yes." "It feels unfinished." "Yes." "And yet you are content." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I am content that no one was murdered." "And the rest?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "The rest belongs to the village." That evening, Miss Marple received a final note. It was delivered without ceremony, placed neatly on the small table beside her chair. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Miss Marple, you have done what was necessary. The matter is concluded." H.W. Miss Marple read it once, then folded it carefully. Mrs. Colwell, watching her, said, "That is not a thank you." "No," said Miss Marple, "it is a dismissal." "Yes." "And you do not object?" Miss Marple shook her head. "My dear Lavinia, in villages one is often dismissed once one has been useful." Mrs. Colwell gave a short laugh. "Like Mr. Harcourt?" Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Yes," she said quietly, "very like Mr. Harcourt." Later that night, as the house grew still, Miss Marple sat by the window one last time. The village lay before her, unpeaceful and composed, its lights glowing softly behind drawn curtains. It was, to all appearances, exactly what it had always been. A perfect village. And yet, Miss Marple's thoughts moved gently over the events of the past week. A man who had tried to control others through knowledge, a secret he could not control, fear that had undone him, and a woman who had chosen silence over revelation. She smiled faintly to herself. "My dear," she murmured, as though speaking to some invisible companion, There is no such thing as a perfect village. Outside, a light went out in one of the cottages, then another and another. One by one, Larkenby settled into sleep, its secrets once again hidden, its order carefully restored, its truth unspoken. In the end, nothing in Larkenby changed and everything did. No scandal broke, no name was ruined. No crime was declared. The village remained what it had always appeared to be, quiet, orderly, respectable. But beneath that surface, something had shifted forever. The illusion of perfection had cracked, and though it had been carefully mended, those who had seen it break would never quite forget. Miss Marple, departing a few days later, carried no evidence, no proof, and no accusations, only understanding, and that, she knew, was often the most dangerous thing of all, because in villages like Larkenby, the truth does not disappear, it simply waits.